Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitcg Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to be able to welcome to this program one of the most well-known and loved classicists of our time, Mary Beard. Mary Beard's documentaries on ancient history for a long time. And in the past few years, I've also been reading some of her books, including SPQR, which sort of began my whole fascination with ancient Rome. I also read Women and Power, which I recommend folks to read as well. And now I'm in the process of reading her latest book and preparing for our conversation today. That's now out in paperback. It's called Emperor of Rome, Ruling the Ancient Roman World. Mary Beard, as I said, it is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this program. I thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you, Mitch. It's great to be with you.
So we are, and you're joining me from Washington, D.C. So you're plugged in.
Yeah, I'm really plugged into the US right now because I'm in Washington DC for 8 months at the National Gallery, and it's I'm having a wonderful and extremely interesting time.
Oh, extremely. I went back to Washington, D.C. after Trump first got elected for his first 100 days. And I remember going to Washington, D.C., thinking, I don't understand it from afar. I need to be there for a little while. And as soon as I landed, I could see on everyone's face, nobody really understood what was going on. And this time it just seems even more overwhelming than 8 years ago. I want to ask, obviously we're living in a time in which people are thinking about power, thinking about political power, thinking about the political power within a single individual or maybe even a small group in a system, a democratic system, a republican system, in which power is usually sort of divided up, not just here, but kind of all over the world. And in this dynamic, it has caused a lot of us to go back to what you specialize in, and that's ancient Rome. And a lot of people think about, and we have thought about on this show, the end of the Roman Republic, again, a republic which divided power in some ways, and how it turned into an empire, which over hundreds and hundreds of years would be ruled by a single individual, the emperor. Do you think, as a specialist on this history, is it appropriate to be looking back at ancient Rome and trying to understand our current moment? Are there positives? Are there dangers?
I think it is. It's always a good idea to look at history, as long as you don't expect too much from it. Um, I don't think that Roman history or any other sort of history provides ready-made answers for us. Um, I don't have much time with many people who I think understandably say to me, well, which Roman emperor is the president most like? Well, none, if you're honest. The Romans and us, we're very different. That said, I think you can see some of the ways that Romans talked about power. And you say we're talking about power a lot now. I think we always talk a lot about power, actually. I don't think it's that new. But they talk about what happens when you have effectively a one-man ruler, and I mean, because no one really ever rules alone, so it's only effectively a one-man ruler, and you can't see how the decisions that they make are made, and how do small courts and courtiers and small cliques and factions around a one-man ruler, how do they work, and what difference does it make to the not just the elite, but to the man in the street, or the woman in the street? Now, I think that the Romans debated that in ways that I think are useful for us to think with. I mean, one of the things that they debated most strongly was the idea of how difficult it was to oppose the one-man ruler. Now, I think that when we look back at Roman autocracy or any kind of dictatorship, I think we always imagine that if that happened to us, we would stand up, we would object, we would be a dissident, we would be part of the opposition. Right? Well, I think what Rome shows us, and many other regimes of a single ruler also show us, is that autocratic regimes actually survive because people let them, because people collaborate with them, because they don't know quite how to oppose them, and they're fearful of what might happen to them or to their families if they do. So, I mean, I think people have a very strong image of ancient Rome as a place where the corridors of power were bloodstained from top to bottom. Now, I'm sure they were in part bloodstained, but I think that most corridors in Rome were bloodstained. It was a very violent place. But the Roman emperor himself, as both a figurehead and an effective ruler, he was sustained because people went along with him. Right? They didn't put their head above the parapet. They moaned when he was dead. And there was plenty of posthumous assassination. You know, when the Roman emperor was dead, everybody said what a bastard he was. When he's alive, they went along with it. And I think that it's kind of useful for us to remember that that is what most people do. And it takes quite a lot to tip the balance between people saying, okay, I'll go to work, I'll moan at night, but I'll keep my head down. To tip that to, I am going to stand up and be counted and say no, that's a big gap.
Well, most people are just trying to live their lives. And whoever the leader is will only have a marginal effect maybe on their actual day-to-day life.
Yeah. And most people are looking after themselves, but they're thinking about their friends and families who, if they do stand up, will be hurt. They're thinking, so that it's not just selfishness. I think it's about, in Rome, it's the cost of doing that. And they tell a good story, and they're always ready with good stories about how, I was told, that I was next on his list to be exiled. All right, these are good story, and it's a good way of letting yourself off the hook. I was really sort of in opposition, but most people aren't. And of course, the Roman Empire, I think, in terms of the one-man ruler, he ruled as much by fear as by bloodshed. By fear and humiliation and a sense of facing people down and shutting them up without actually killing them. I mean, autocrats who kill actually put themselves in a very vulnerable position. But I love the story of, or love and hate, find it a very revealing story of the first Emperor Augustus. And he has a friend who he discovers has been talking about some of the state secrets he's discussed with Augustus, particularly who's going to succeed him. And the guy comes round to dinner after Augustus has heard this, and he says, hello, good evening, Emperor. Augustus just turns to him and says, goodbye, Marcus. The guy goes away and kills himself at home. And it's that kind of sense of the sense of menace, which means that you police yourself.
And you always find that. That's what we do. We do police ourselves.
Yeah. And I think that we wrongly imagine, and I think it doesn't really help us understand a system of autocracy. We imagine that it runs entirely by the sword. doesn't. It runs by collaboration, fear, and gossip.
And it has to run, right? I mean, it has to serve some function in society it still needs legitimacy, credibility.
Yeah. And and also, you look at the Roman Empire, vast extent, Spain to Syria and the Sahara to Scotland. It's the biggest European empire there's ever been. And okay, the Romans have rather low expectations of what rule means. They're not trying to impose on everybody particular ways of thought or even, much loyalty beyond not making a fuss. But the show has to be kept on the road. And one of the other things that I think people misrepresent. It's very easy to follow some of the more lurid accounts, both in ancient and modern writing, and to imagine that the emperors were one deranged psychopath after the next. Well, if they were, how did the Roman Empire survive? Now, it's very hard to know what they were like. And, some of them were no doubt more diligent and some of them more louche and some of them more cruel than others. But essentially, there was a job to be done. They had a staff, that's true. And the staff may well have taken care of the day-to-day correspondence and the day-to-day decision making. But the emperor has to be there to do some things. And my feeling after I'd written about the Emperor of Rome, and I think the book isn't about one emperor after another, it's about what is it to be the Roman emperor. It's a kind of job description in a way for the Roman emperor. I thought probably their lives were actually, sorry to be a party pooper, but more boring than we tend to think. And one of the things that we imagine the Roman emperor always doing is, banqueting and too much wine, a lot of grapes, and a huge amount of sex in ways that we cannot possibly now even begin to imagine. And some of that might be true. Some of that might certainly be true. But it's interesting that when one of the ways that Romans imagine the emperor, even if they have never seen him, because most of the population of the Roman Empire never would have seen him. What do they imagine in his hand? They imagine a pen. They imagine him actually as the head bureaucrat. Now, sometimes he's doing things he shouldn't with his pen, right? He's using it as a weapon or whatever. But when they think of the emperor, they very often think of him pen in hand. And that's because big part of the job was writing, was signing off things, was making bureaucratic decisions. Now, it makes for a less exciting story in some ways than the sex and violence. And I have, people are thinking of getting the book. I can promise there's quite a lot of sex and violence in there. But there's also the pen and there's the bureaucracy and there's what these guys actually did, I mean, I'm afraid if we went to most one-man rulers, we'd find an awful lot more paperwork than we imagined.
Yeah, I bet. Coming back to the early years of the empire, of the time of one-man rule with emperors, and you mentioned Augustus, oftentimes considered the first, even though Julius Caesar is the one who declared himself dictator for life. Dictator was actually an office within the Republic that was designed to deal with emergencies because, you couldn't use the whole deliberative body to try to deal with emergencies. So you needed a dictator. Sounds like a good idea if you didn't foresee it bringing an end to your Republic. Julius Caesar gives himself the title dictator for life. He gets assassinated. This is at the end of a very long and bloody and lots of political violence, bloody civil war. And then Augustus comes to power. He reigns for decades, very long time, probably solidifies the empire. Is there opposition to Augustus and now this one man rule? we're talking just a few years after the fall of the Republic. Uh, what happens there?
Um, yes, there is. Interestingly, though, we have very little historical narrative written from within the reign of Augustus himself. Um, After the reign of Augustus, he very quickly becomes canonized as the founder of the Roman imperial system, of the system of one man rule. And in that canonization, a lot of the opposition gets written out. You know, the standard story becomes the story of a man who takes control at the end of a civil war and brings peace and prosperity to the Roman world, just as Augustus would have wanted. Now, you can begin slightly, occasionally, to see through some of that narrative and to see that there were objections to Augustus's rule, right through the reign, probably. And we can certainly see that in the period before he takes control, the anti-Augustus propaganda at that point is, and maybe the truth of some of Augustus's deeds, is really kind of virulent. I mean, there are stories about him tearing people's eyes out with his bare hands. He is, so he's one of those guys, and we've seen them in the modern world. The terrorist leader who miraculously transforms themselves into, an elder statesman almost overnight. And so there is, I'm absolutely certain, opposition bubbling up under the surface, and it's probably put down quite effectively. I think, though, that Augustus is the beneficiary. He's a beneficiary of a very long reign. So he manages to establish himself. There are still huge puzzles. He's the heir of Julius Caesar, who's been assassinated. There's a horrible period of civil war. One of the things we don't know is that when he arrives back in Rome, basically the last man standing, and is going to make himself one-man ruler, we have no idea what kind of plan he had in his head. I mean, later Romans retroject a kind of master plan. He's coming back from defeating Antony and Cleopatra, and he's got the master plan in his head. Well, he might have done, but it's much more likely that, particularly seeing he has quite a bit of time, that it's a series of improvisations which actually work. Now, there must have, I think my sense is, although you can't ever see this now, is he must have had loads of ideas that didn't work and got dropped. But what he's doing, he's constantly improvising, he's sucking it and seeing, and a kind of master plan emerges, but without it being planned in advance. And I think when you say opposition, I think we have to distinguish between opposition to the ruling emperor, in this case, Augustus, and opposition to the whole idea of one-man rule. Now, in the reign of Augustus, there probably still was a little bit of opposition to the whole idea of one-man rule. There was still a possibility that you might have gone back to the quasi-democratic republic. Mostly, though, what we see is people being opposed to whatever emperor is on the throne and wanting to have their favorite, not the ruling incumbent. And it's actually you don't see in the writing that we have, and of course that's inadequate, but it's still indicative. You don't see in the writing that we have any specific opposition to one-man rule itself after the middle of the 1st century CE, after 30 years after Augustus has died, the assassination of Caligula, there is this tiny flash where somebody says, I think, gentlemen, we should go back to the Republic. How about that? And the account we have of that is wonderful in the Jewish writer Josephus, because what is clear is that it's by that stage too little too late. By the time this guy is making that great speech advocating, return to democracy, the Emperor Claudius has already been declared emperor and is sort of sitting in the Imperial palace. So it is futile. And it's what is surprising about the Roman system of one-man rule is how quickly the system, even if the individual, gets accepted. Now, loads of ruling emperors were killed, right? But they weren't killed in order to restore a republic. They were killed in order to put somebody else on the throne.
What was the Republic maligned then during the time of the Empire as something that we wouldn't want to go back to, something that was chaotic and brought instability?
Amongst some, I'm sure. I think more what we get is a kind of slightly nostalgic romance about it, but always in the realm of fantasy. It was, you couldn't actually bring it back. Yes. You might say that those heroes of the Republic, the ones that conquered the world, etc., in Roman terms, they were great heroes. But they're kind of in the realm of romantic mythology, really. So you can worship the Scipios who conquer Carthage, but that's different from thinking that system could run the Roman world. And in some senses, that's, they've got a point in thinking that it was inappropriate. I mean, in some ways, the Roman Republic was a victim of its own success. It, for whatever reason, still much debated, acquired this vast empire, but it's still trying to govern it with the institutions of a small city state. They're having, one of the problems is people only hold office for 1 year at a time. Well, by the time you get to 60 BCE, it probably takes you 3.5 months if you want to go to the borders of the empire, another 3.5 months to come back. That's more than half your whole period of office. It is deeply unsuited to governing this large, vast land and sea-based empire. And so to some extent, they tinker with it. They try to find ways of extending it, extending people's office holding. They tinker at the margins. They're quite aware that there's a problem, but they never really solve it. And the thing that solves it in the end, and there are a few shots at it before Julius Caesar, the thing that solves it is saying, okay, one man's going to rule this. We're going to have continuity here, guys. And it's continuity that came at quite a price for the democratic institutions of the Republic, quasi-democratic. I mean, you should never really call Rome a democracy. It was always the kind of government of the wealthy.
With democratic elements, like the wealthy could participate in the democratic process. And
yeah, it was the people could vote for which of the wealthy they liked, right? So there was popular power, and there were some areas of popular decision-making, like whether to go to war or not, that were really fundamentally vested in the people. However, the voting system was cleverly skewed, so it gave more voting power to the rich than to the poor.
In this transition...
So at every point in the Republic, the rich have the advantage. And, if you said to a Roman, a member of the Roman elite in the late Republic, is Rome a democracy? He'd say, "Oh my goodness me, no! Democracy. That's kind of, that's an absolutely dreadful institution that those Greeks had, and look how they failed. We're not a democracy. We're a republic."
Rule of the poor.
Yeah, that's right. The rule of the mob, rule of the poor. That's what they saw democracy as.
With this transition from republic to empire, you'll forgive me for being so fixated on
It's
this
all right.
dynamic. What happened to the Senate, the former senators, the former Republicans?
Well, this is where Augustus is clever, because they were scooped up into the new regime. The Senate remained as as the main council of state, quite the limits of its power and the changing limits of its power is much discussed. The same elected offices remain, although they're not elected any longer by the people, they're elected within the Senate. So you still became consul, or you still became praetor. So many of the outward forms of the Republican political life remained with an emperor at the top of it. Now, this has been a huge matter of dispute amongst modern historians for centuries, actually. And one common, but I think deeply flawed view of this is to say somehow Augustus managed to con the Senate, right? He managed to trick the elite into thinking nothing had changed, right? And you can still be consul. The Senate still meets. In fact, the Senate gets a few extra honours. And, so he kind of bought them off with this fib, this lie, while he was really running the show. Now, I can see why people have thought that, but it implies that the Senate were really dim. They have noticed. The Roman elite are quite smart, and there is no way they haven't noticed that Augustus is now running things, right? So you have to look for another way of explaining what Augustus is doing here. And in part, what I think it's doing is providing a kind of rhetorical continuity that you're actually, it's a revolution which uses the same terms, the same sorts of power structure, but they've been turned on their heads in some ways. And he has to do that partly because he needs the Senate. We kind of always think about the one-man ruler as being the one-man ruler. Well, the one-man ruler is never the one-man ruler, particularly if he's ruling this vast empire. So he needs people, he needs the elite to be on side. So he is offering them some kind of continuity, and they, by and large, are playing ball with that. They are collaborating. And what we tend to forget, I think, because we have this slightly rosy glow about the end of about the Republic, not so much the end, we tend to forget what the end of the Republic was like. It was civil war.
It's chaos.
And you could go home and find your brother had been murdered by some rival clique. And to some extent, our romantic attachment to the Republic, it was shared by some Romans, and it became increasingly shared the further distant it was. But at the time, I think you might think anything for a quiet life, safe life.
I've always said that if your society, if your world is living in chaotic conditions, the people will accept a strong-armed authoritarian dictator to step in if they think it could provide normalcy.
They will, and they have to see what the cost is. I mean, that's the problem. It's, I think, accepting a strong-armed dictatorship is one thing. how are you going to get rid of it? And what's interesting about Rome is they don't get rid of it.
No.
Um, and in the Eastern Roman Empire, they have imperial rule up to the 15th century. Right? I mean, we tend to think of the Roman Empire in the West falling in the 5th century, but it's going on to the 15th century. And it does come at the cost, without doubt, of all kinds of forms of political liberty. Now, the Romans, I think, were quite bad at seeing how you might reactivate liberty. But perhaps it's it's perhaps something that we need to think about.
You write in your book that we're in conversation about, Emperor of Rome ruling the ancient Roman world, that you have come to detest autocracy as a political system. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first part of a kind of two-part sentence where I say I've come to detest autocracy as a political system, but I've come to feel a little bit more sorry for the poor old autocrat. I think that where the Romans, I think in some of their more reflective moments got it right, was they saw the Orwellian nature of what dictatorship and autocracy was. The people close to the emperor, and this probably went more widely, but certainly the people close to the emperor saw that the system of one-man rule somehow it changed what you could say. It tried to change what you could think, and it turned the world upside down. And they looked on the Roman emperor as someone who you could never trust and never believe, and yet were somehow in alliance with. I mean, I think a nice example of that is a very strange story told by about an early 3rd century CE emperor Elagabalus, about how he invites some of his friends to dinner. And at the end of the dinner, he showers them with rose petals, but he showers them with so many rose petals that they smother and die. Now, this story cannot be true. I do not believe it is remotely possible to smother people with rose petals. But like many of the untrue anecdotes about Roman emperors, it's really getting to a political puzzle at the heart of the image of the emperor, which is the emperor's the kind of guy who kills you when he looks as if he's being kind. He looks as if he's being generous, but he's actually killing you. And Romans are constantly, I think, worried about the way autocracy distorts the way the world is. Emperors try to change the very nature of the natural world. And they tell what we think of often, I think, as rather silly little stories about that. Elagabalus also, he's supposed to have stayed up all night to work and, slept all day, right? And you think, oh gosh, this is a kind of story about a slightly cavalier teenager, which is what he was. It's also saying at the very heart of the Roman Empire, there's a guy who doesn't obey the laws of nature, and that you go to the palace and you can't trust a thing you see or hear. Now, partly that's because of flattery, right? When you talk to the emperor, you don't ever say what you think. You say what you know or you think he wants you to say, right? And so there is a kind of pollution of free speech in an autocracy. You are afraid to say what you know to be true. It's emperor's new clothes kind of stuff, I think the other side of it is why you feel slightly sorry for the emperor, although I'm, glad we don't have one, is everybody is caught up in this sense of nothing is true, nothing is what it seems. The emperor, he might be at the top of the pinnacle, but one thing he knows is that no one will ever tell him the truth. So the Senate and the courtiers, the friends of the emperor, they don't tell him, they don't say what they think, but he knows he can't believe anything that he hears. So there is a kind of vicious Orwellian double bind here, that words just don't mean what they seem to mean.
It's a totalitarianism of thought
Yeah,
that everyone knows there's a hollowness to it.
yeah, yeah. We know it's empty, and yet we pretend it's full. And I think that's something which marks out authoritarian regimes. It changes the language in which you speak, and it changes what you can believe. And you go to dinner with the emperor, and you don't know whether he's being kind or cruel. And so there's a kind of chillingness to it that I think that it's difficult for most of us to understand, but I think that one always has to be on the watch for that in authoritarian regimes, autocratic regimes.
There's a real art form to it, it sounds like.
I mean, there's, one of the best stories is the story of the Emperor Domitian in the end of the 1st century CE. He invites a load of well-born Romans, elite Romans, to dinner. They think, oh, great, dinner at the palace, that's great, Just like me getting an invitation to Buckingham Palace, of course I'll say yes, even if I'm, right, kind of party invite to die for. They go round to the palace. They are shown into the emperor's dining room, and they look round, and it's very weird. Everything is painted black. The servants are all naked but painted black. All the couches on which they're going to dine are black, except that by each one there is a silver plaque naming them, giving them their seat, naming kind of place card, but in silver, but it's in the shape of a tombstone. And they get served funerary food, kind of food you get at funeral. And the emperor only talks about death the whole evening. He's sitting there saying, philosophizing about death. They think it was going to be a great party, but they're absolutely terrified because they think they're going to be killed at the end of it. The end of the evening comes, and the emperor says, "Oh, very nice to see you all. See you again." And they're taken home, and they think, "Phew, escaped." And they get home. A few minutes passed, and then there's a knock at the door, and they think, "Now my last hour's come." Now he sent the hit squad. But they go outside. They see who's outside, and it isn't a hit squad, but it is a group of men from the palace bringing presents from the emperor, including the silver tombstone on which their name had been inscribed as a gift from Domitian. Now, it's a bit like the story of the rose petals smothering you. This is about fear, it's about humiliation, and it's about how you can't tell the difference between when the emperor is being generous and when he's actually out to get you. And it's that tightrope, that not knowing how to read it. That is partly where imperial power, that is how imperial power is wielded. What is he really thinking? What is he really going to do next? It's the unpredictability of it. And you don't have to kill people. You don't actually have to shed blood to terrify people.
Was it important to get this story out to make sure people knew this story?
I think that one of the things you might well argue is that those kind of stories then took on a life of their own, because they're saying, be careful of the emperor, be careful. It has a sort of happy ending, and I'm sure that Domitian himself could tell it with a kind of twinkle in his eye if he wanted to. What an amazing fancy dress party I gave.
So no one died?
No one died, but everybody is absolutely terrified. And you do the work by those kind of ingenious forms of terror.
Are there times when it was a scary? I was scared when you were telling me the story. I mean, I thought for sure they're going to die.
They're going to die. They're bad. We know what the ending to this story is, especially when there's the knock on the door. Now it's come now. That's what they thought.
Do you find? I mean, you go through a lot of different emperors. Do you find moments when emperors do find that there are limits to their power?
That usually comes in assassination. But sometimes we get a few little vignettes, whether they're true or not, it's very hard to say, where they are, where somebody makes them see the nature of their own manipulation. There's a very nice story, nice, revealing story about the Emperor Tiberius in the Senate. And there's a trial is happening of someone who has been arguably disloyal to Tiberius, but there is going to be a proper, as normal, vote in the Senate, whether they're guilty or innocent. And before the voting takes place, it looks like that the emperor himself is going to vote last. To preempt this, one clever guy says, Tiberius, it'd be really good if you'd cast your vote first, because I don't want to get my vote wrong by mistake. Right? So he is outing the emperor's manipulation of the vote. Saying, okay, if you're going to come and take against us because we have voted innocent and you're going to vote guilty, you've got to, sorry guys, we're not going along with that. And of course, that manipulates Tiberius into voting innocent.
Oh.
So, but it's a kind of rather clever way. I mean, this is a war of words which exposes Tiberius's corruption. And it also can come from the bottom too. I think there's a very interesting story, a chilling story again, about the Emperor Hadrian, who gets very cross because he's in a bad mood with one of his enslaved servants. And this is one of the pen stories. Hadrian gets so cross that he stabs this enslaved guy in the eye and blinds him in that eye. Very soon, Hadrian feels absolutely remorseful and asks for the guy to be brought to him. And he says, look, I'm absolutely, I'm terribly sorry. I'll give you anything. I'll give you anything. What would you like? And the slave says, I'd like my eye back, please. Again, that story kind of exposes both the aggressive and unwieldy power of the emperor, but is also his inability to undo what he's done. It kind of exposes his weakness as well as his appalling strength. So you get there. You get those kind of verbal joustings that do expose the emperor's power and vulnerability, upstage him in a way. The slave upstages the emperor, though loses his eye.
Mary Beard has been our guest. Mary Beard has joined us for a conversation on her latest book, which is now out in paperback. It's called Emperor of Rome, Ruling the Ancient Roman World. Mary Beard, those were fascinating stories, and I thank you for taking time to share them with us.
Thank you very much, Mitch. It's been great to be with you.